On the 14th of March, Cyclone Idai made landfall in Mozambique. On the 15th, it hit the Eastern Highlands, Chimanimani and Chipinge, the worst affected areas. Hundreds lost their lives, hundreds more went missing, and thousands were displaced. Roads and bridges destroyed, schools, homes, hospitals damaged. The acceleration of climate change has increased the occurrence of extreme weather effects such as droughts, floods, and cyclones. Here to discuss this and more, I have Emily Matingo, a climate change scientist, Wimbiso Simbi, an urban sustainability specialist, and Komborero Charamba, an environmental engineer. I am Chris Charamba, and this is Politics and Beyond. So to start off with, someone like myself with very basic knowledge, what exactly is climate change?
Climate change is the change in average weather conditions caused by human activities. The human activities we are looking at have something to do with burning of fossil fuels, rapid industrialization by the Western countries, which take you back to that time of the Industrial Revolution. And then we also talk of cutting down of trees as well as combustion. I think maybe in summary that would detail what we are saying when we talk of climate change.
Just to add on to what she said, I think instead of going broader, the easiest way to do it is to maybe make it a bit smaller. Climate change has been brought about by increased anthropogenic activities, which is basically humans and our activities on the planet. So this includes predominantly industrialization, which is the main contributor to carbon dioxide, which is creating the greenhouse effect, which is ultimately accelerating climate change. It's something that's always occurred, but now it's occurring at a much more rapid rate than it was ever in any time in history.
So, sorry.
Just to add on to what Wimbiso has said, naturally the climate changes, but it becomes an issue when our human activities accelerate the change. That's why we are having some of the impacts that we're having today, and much hype or talk about climate change. It's because of the human-induced change that is of particular concern to our livelihoods, to our economies, and everything.
So within climate change is this term greenhouse gases. Does anyone like to explain what exactly those are and how they affect, the change of climate, the increase in the temperatures in global temperatures? Because I understand that they have an effect on global temperatures, the Earth's core and such increasing.
So the atmosphere is 1% gases, and within these 1% gases there is carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and the ozone. So naturally the Earth, because it cools during the day, it heats up during the day and cools, it releases infrared radiation, right? So when this infrared radiation is released back into the atmosphere, some of it is trapped and some of it is let out. Now the trapped infrared radiation now escapes back into the ozone, causing the Earth to then heat up, which is what causes the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is a natural occurring phenomenon. However, now when it is accelerated, because there's so much of the carbon dioxide going out of the Earth, we have global warming, which is what our problem really is.
So the big thing you guys talk about is industrialization as, a cause of increased climate change, or a rapid increase in climate change. And it is mainly, countries in your more developed countries. So you're looking at your USAs, your Germanys, Japans, your first world countries that are more industrialized and have contributed, whereas your less developed countries or your developing countries, they tend not to, or I don't know what percentage do they contribute to climate change? So countries like Zimbabwe.
In terms of developing countries and the issue of developed countries, you are right to say that it's the industrialized countries such as the America, Germany, and the likes that have contributed most to the current climate change impact that we are having today because of their rapid industrialization. If you look at China, it it has got a lot of number of cars which also emit into the atmosphere. We talk of giant industries and so forth. And relatively, without quantifying figures, African countries, together with the rest of developing countries, have got a very small emitting capacity in terms of greenhouse gases. There are a lot of issues that bring us to that position where we are saying that, for example, Zimbabwe is a net emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. It also goes to do with issues of economic productivity. It also goes to do with issues of our capacity, and just generally that we are still to develop in that trajectory that these developed countries have so far developed along that pathway. And also that disparity between the emissions or the causes of climate change between the developed countries and the developing countries is what has also caused for there to be what is called as the Paris Agreement, which was born of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we're saying in a nutshell that developing countries sort of benefit or are supported by developed countries for them to increase their adaptation and mitigation options because they are not responsible for the climate change we're having today.
Wimbiso, you are an urban sustainability specialist. Obviously, development, industrialization is related to development. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, developing countries talk about is, industrializing and mechanizing their industries for their economies to grow. But that will then, have a negative effect or, on climate change. So what exactly is it that, countries like Zimbabwe should be looking at or should be doing to deal with? How do you balance the issue of industrialization and climate change for the developing world?
I think essentially the easiest way to look at it is to consider how the developed countries have developed and where they've ended up. And where us as developing countries, where we are literally at the raw stage, where we can actually learn from their mistakes and choose to take a more sustainable trajectory in comparison to the 100% industrialization, because we are in the technological age. There are green industries, there are smart cities. Technology is here to essentially remove us from the trajectory where we just become a developed country that is increasing our carbon emissions, and we are simply developing for the sake of progress rather than having our development guided by sustainability, which is essentially the definition of sustainability is ensuring that the environment that we have right now, that we have access to, future generations to come have the same equal access, because access to the environment is a right. It is a right for us to be able to go outside, see the birds and the bees, have that fresh air, be able to go outside, have a little small garden. It's a right that we have, and we cannot take that away from future generations. So we need to make sure that as we develop, we are more sustainably conscious or green conscious as we go along, because we have the added benefits of technology, of research, of history not repeating itself.
So just to follow up, to add on to what Wimbiso said, as a country, in terms of wanting to ensure that we develop sustainably, we are also in the process of developing what we call a low emission development strategy. This low emission development strategy will focus on detailing how the country will envisage to develop in the key economic sectors that identified by the National Climate Policy. We have our water sector, our energy sector, our health, our industry, forestry, and biodiversity, among others. So to see how are these sectors going to develop in a low carbon trajectory. Then also to say that in terms of our industries, in terms of our mining, we need to also do away with obsolete equipment, which have got a big or a high carbon emission pathway, and replace them with green technologies. We're also talking of greening the economy. Greening the economy is all about reducing our emissions and carbon footprint. Then we're talking about, where possible, let's adopt renewable energy options. Zimbabwe has got vast and abundant solar energy. It's usually quite hot, that we can harness the renewable energy, which can then also replace over time fossil fuel energy. And then of course the aspect to do with adoption of climate smart agricultural practices, which over time also reduce emissions from the agricultural sector. So these, if adopted, will ensure that the country develops in a low carbon trajectory, which is different from the pathway that has been adopted by the developed countries when they did their rapid industrializations. And that way we can monitor and keep track our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions.
I actually also want to add on developing countries. It almost sounds like we are excusing them. They also add to the greenhouse gases because we have low industrialization and we also have low urbanization. So we're using more fossil fuels. There's more deforestation occurring at rapid levels because this is what people are using to cook. These are their livelihoods and their methods. So absolutely, I think developing countries are adding just as much.
Yeah, you're right, Kombo, when you say that everyone is contributing to climate change globally. But you find that the contribution made by developing countries is relatively small when you compare the kind of impact being done by America versus what a poor country where they are using abundant firewood or coal to light up their houses. It just is different.
Yes, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. It is different. But in a country like Zimbabwe, where we are trying to address the people that we have here, I think we don't want to develop but that's not our problem. They said our percentage is small. I think the essence is to always address everybody, including at small scale like Zimbabwe.
Can I just add on to the concept that I think Kombo was trying to drive home is the concept of the sink and how forests are the carbon sinks. So ultimately with all the carbon dioxide that is being produced in the atmosphere, your rainforest, your natural vegetation is acting as the sinks. It's essentially our first defense to climate change. So as we do not control or manage our urban growth or grow sustainably, we are simply saying it's okay, we are a small country, we're not producing any emissions, therefore it's okay for us to cut down trees and do all this, but we're not considering how in the long run this habit with us as Zimbabweans, I'm going to use Zimbabwe as an example, as Zimbabweans, the habit of simply cutting down trees and not planting them again is something that I feel we've almost said, okay, this is the role of the government to do, or the Tree Forestry Commission, or whoever it is, but me as a person, I do not have electricity at home. So I'm going to go outside and chop some trees, and that's okay. There isn't the green consciousness of the greater impact of my cutting down of this tree. There isn't any awareness of what is the actual impact of me cutting down a tree every single week for my whole life, for the past 30 years that I've lived in Epworth. And not just me, as my family grows, I am cutting down even more trees. So essentially, I think it's really important that as developing countries, as the sinks, we need to step up and not think that because we are not producers, we are not simply as accountable as every other country on the planet.
So since you've spoken about Zimbabwe and spoken about the issue of cutting down trees, and it's not just for livelihoods. There's also an economic aspect to it. Tobacco is one of the largest crops in this country, and there's a lot of wood. They use wood in the curing of tobacco, so there is that deforestation happening in that regard. I guess the question, and it will come to you, Emily, as somebody from the ministry, is what policies are there actually in place to combat climate change and to in defense of some of these things that we're dealing with in terms of deforestation and also the risks that are involved. Spoke about climate change causing an increase in extreme weather activities. So what policies are in place for protection against climate change?
The country has been putting in place an enabling environment for climate change management and programming, which also include issues to do with several policies. But just to take you back to the International Forum of Climate Change, governed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it has put in place a mechanism whereby developing countries who have potential to be carbon sinks, as articulated by my colleagues here, can actually benefit from carbon trading through, in layman terms, what we call being paid to keep a tree standing. The mechanism is called reducing emission from deforestation and land degradation. So as a country, we've also participated once, I think, through the Kariba Red Plus project, where we're also trying to see how we could also benefit from such an initiative. And if adopted through, obviously, behavioral change by people in the communities, supported by the government, I think that can also be a good opportunity for us for sinking the carbon, and then we can trade those in the international market because developing countries can actually trade their excess amount to the developed countries, and then we can use that money to build our resilience. Now, coming back to our national issue, we have put in place what is called the forest policy, which will also look to the issues of sustainable forest management so that we can address the issues of forest degradation. We can address the issues of cutting down of trees, among other issues. I'm sure the policy, once in place, will be launched very soon. And then in terms of the real climate change issues, in 2017, the Honorable President launched the National Climate Policy, and this policy will seek to enhance our coordination of climate change issues to ensure that we successfully mainstream the issues of climate change in order to climate-proof our economic sectors and our livelihoods towards sustainable development. And then we have also put in place what is called a National Climate Change Response Strategy, and this one focuses on how we can essentially adapt or build our resilience to climate change. Why this strategy was developed is that as a developing country, our focus is not much on net sinking of emissions, net sinking of issues to do with the GHGs, but it's more on the bread and butter.
GHGs being greenhouse gases.
Yes, it's more on the bread and butter issues of saying how can we enhance our resilience now that there is a cyclone. How can I continue to survive? You know, the real issues are that we can only be able to focus on the mitigation core benefits when we are able to climate proof our livelihoods. So those are the issues. When you talk of National Climate Change Response Strategy, we're saying that adaptation is our thrust.
So you're talking about climate proofing, and we spoke, like I said, about the risks that climate change has. What are some of the things, from the both of you, being in urban sustainability and an engineer, what are some of the things that we should be doing as a nation, or as individuals, as businesses, and as government? I think if we look at it in different sectors, to climate proof.
I think to begin, for starters, I think we should just start with our municipality. For one, there is absolutely nothing going on there, to be honest. If we look at our waste material and stuff, those things, as waste decomposes, it releases methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And that's a problem already on its own, just outside your gate. And there's no one taking time to, I don't know, but it doesn't look like there's...
Actually add on to that. So if we look, for example, at the Pomona dump fire that happened, I think it was last year or 2 years ago. The Pomona dump site was decommissioned in 2001, if I'm correct. And it is still currently standing. If you drive by there today, right now, you will see fumes of smoke spiraling up from the actual dump fire on a very hot day. Sometimes it's very flammable, and it's small things like that show you how broken down the system itself in just urban areas that are already stressed by population. Anyone can tell you when you have any area that is stressed, it's not going to be efficient in what it's doing. So if you're looking at the environment to be efficient, it can't be efficient because it is overwhelmed by the sheer number of the population in that area. We can look at how we're building on top of wetlands, and then when it rains, it almost appears as if we're confused as to why certain houses are flooding. You are not supposed to build on top of wetlands, but somehow certain areas are greenlit for these constructions.
Just to add on to what my colleagues are saying, I think maybe the issue would be to say that as part of climate proofing our infrastructure, there will be need for serious adherence to the issues of our building codes. Because if we ensure that there are building codes and standards for a certain environment, whether it's an industrial environment or residential environment, then we can also be able to cushion ourselves from the potential danger of having these infrastructures wiped down by heavy rains. Yeah.
So, what about, what about the solutions for people, outside the urban areas? So, in the communities that were struck by Cyclone Idai, for example, you have people living in those areas who live, for example, close to water sources because they rely on water from rivers and lakes and dams. Some of them live close to forests because they rely on that for a source of energy for their cooking, and that sort of thing. So how do people in those areas, how do we climate proof those areas, and what should we be doing for people there, and what should they be doing for themselves?
I think when we talk about renewable energy, we make it sound like a really big thing, but people in the rural areas or outside of the urban areas, we need to be planting trees. We need to be building proper irrigation lines. I mean, we don't need to be running through, we don't. We can be better at that.
Yeah. And I mean, essentially what we're saying, I think what Kombo is trying to say is that, you have these vulnerability assessments that are done for vulnerable communities, and this is often people in rural areas that would be a rural community close to in a low-lying area next to a river. So when we are then considering distributing resources such as perhaps irrigation pipes or which area needs a water system the most, you consider those areas and you consider engaging them. And if, for example, it's a cultural issue and they're not comfortable with moving, you consider reinforcing their houses. You consider putting in an evacuation policy. It's all right, you can stay here, but when there is an evacuation call, move to higher areas, move here, make sure that these particular systems are in place.
Okay, just to add on to what my colleagues are saying, the government has what is called the Civil Protection Department, and in times of disasters, they activate their substructures at subnational level up to ward level. And these structures are important in that they actually convey the messages to people. But in terms of issues of telling people to evacuate to safe ground, it's one thing telling Chris to move away from this area and Chris actually doing it. But in terms of putting systems in place, these systems are there, but they just need to be strengthened so that the reactiveness or the response, when I tell Chris to evacuate to a place of safety, they'll respond. I think it also goes to do again with the issues of behavioral change. In most of our work that we've done at district level, you find that when you engage with people at community level, when you're asking them about climate change, they will allude it to issues to do with, for example, some will say that people are doing incest, or they are alluded to some certain myth in their communities. Then they'll say that that's why it will not rain, or somebody will say that because we're having election in this year, it's going to be a drought. But they are saying it because of their own knowledge that they've studied over time. So there is very need for a thorough and extensive awareness raising on climate change issues so that people can appreciate that some of the things that are happening are not as a result of some myth they are climatized with, but because of the issues of climate change. When the communities are able to accept that climate change is real and it's upon us, then when you tell them that stop growing maize and cheredi because it will fail, then they will listen to you. But as long as they think that climate change is not upon us, or it's something that is far-fetched, when you tell them to adopt small grains, they will not adopt. When you tell them to pursue alternative livelihood options so that they do not go hungry, they will not do that. But they'll continue to grow these crops such as maize because it's a staple food, and then they go hungry, and then it's the government again that has to come in and source aid and give them.
So it's not just people in the rural areas who deny that climate change exists. Donald Trump is a huge climate change denier, and I think the USA either they threatened to or they actually did pull out of the Paris Agreement as one of the things. So it goes beyond just people in the rural areas. But one thing that hasn't come up is to discuss the actual risks. I know we mentioned droughts, floods, and cyclones, but what are some of the other risks that people should actually be cognizant of, so that they can look out for it and say, okay, there's something that I should be aware of, and I should think of how we can deal with that.
For starters, the rise in temperature, air temperature, just generally, that shows you how much carbon dioxide is going into the air and how much is getting trapped. We're not really affected by sea level, but that is also a thing where the glaciers are melting, and that means there's a rise in sea level. The intensity of natural disasters, that's also really a sign of how much climate is changing.
To add on to that, there are also the health risks that would come to light. So, for example, with increased flooding comes increased damage to infrastructure. So you're going to have different types of water mixing that shouldn't be mixing. So cholera, bilharzia, any kind of waterborne typhoid, any waterborne disease is going to probably also be increased. And then with the heat, you have people who with pre-existing conditions becoming even more vulnerable. So, for example, if I genuinely have a high blood pressure, the hotter it is, the more at risk my blood pressure is to go up, or my symptoms are to worsen. Then there's also the issue of, I guess it doesn't really affect society, but it affects your biodiversity. So, alien species being able to grow in places they normally couldn't grow. Your biodiversity being damaged by the increased heat. So, I mean, we can look at the Kariba weed, for example. You then have...
Sorry, Kariba weed, like...
So...
Water ice.
Sorry.
Water ice.
Sorry. It's commonly known as the Kariba weed. I'm not sure what the scientific term is. But it's essentially this water-based weed that really grows very well on water and heat. But as the heat has increased and we've had hotter and longer summers, it's growing and spreading even more than it was prior to, I suppose, the more increased, the hotter summers that we're having now.
Yeah. To add on to what Kombo and Wimbiso have said, in terms of biodiversity, of particular interest to me is the issues to do with loss of livelihoods as a result of climate change. I'll give an example of Madora or Macimbi, or they call them Mopani worms. Those Mopani worms have been a source of livelihood or a source of income for several families, if not thousands of families, especially in Matabeleland North, who have been married by people who actually collect Madora for their survival, and they've taken their kids to school using income from the Mopani worms. But now, because of climate change, due to the erratic rain, due to uncertainty in the rainfall, and those issues, their livelihood is threatened. And when their livelihood is threatened, then they are not sure how they're going to survive, because another thing is that in places where we have Mopani worms, the rainfall is not so good enough for maize. So it's actually a big risk. And then when you talk of water issues, the biggest threat would be in terms of the wash sector, water and sanitation hygiene issues. They are going to be really threatened. Taking you to the recent issue of Cyclone Idai, you find that there have been reports that the sewage and water pipes, they burst, and this then caused a health hazard because our wash has been affected. So climate change really threatens to derail our efforts that we have made as a government in terms of addressing our wash issues.
A question that I want to know, a personal one, because I think I'm an offender, is plastic straws. Mm-hmm. Plastic in general. We use a lot of plastic in this country. But is there a benefit in cutting out the use of plastic straws? I'll talk about straws specifically, but we can go wider and then mention plastic in general and the uses for plastic that we have.
It will always be beneficial to cut down on any kind of plastic in any scenario. Mm-hmm. But in this particular situation, yes, straws are contributing to plastic, but there's other plastic materials that I think deserve more attention than straws.
Such as?
K-Lite. K-Lite, when you go and you get food, your K-Lite,
Yeah.
which has been
the
actually
government
outlawed,
did
but
outlaw that.
it's still being used, and then it's now been replaced by, I'm not sure what type of plastic it is, but it's almost a stronger plastic that's even more difficult to break down and recycle. So although we've kind of closed the door on one problem, we've opened the door on another problem. And instead of perhaps moving to recycled paper boxes, similar to what you'd find the steers, remember the steers boxes,
Yeah.
or what you see Chicken Inn doing. Those boxes, or whoever's manufacturing those, if we could simply replicate that on a larger scale. Because in Zim, you want to go have your sadza for $2 in Bari. Sometimes maybe you're doing business in town. Maybe sometimes you want to go somewhere fancy. But ultimately, both those places, Vic 22 and Bari, are giving you the same takeaway box.
I remember when I was doing a story on K-Lights, and I spoke to the guys at Emma when they were banning, and one of the things that came up in my research was boxes made out of sugarcane waste, or so. I think it's the waste that comes from sugarcane, the pulp
yes.
that you can then use to make boxes. And I wonder if anyone, I know Green Fuel does stuff with sugarcane. I don't know if they use the pulp, but the whole of it's Chiredzi, where we have sugarcane as one of the big crops. I wonder if they've got something going on, or if there's anyone who's tried to see what they can do in that area.
Chances are that there probably are a lot of people who've probably recycled and created very great products, but the uptake of those products, it's difficult to fit that into a pre-existing packaging system. So that's when you'd probably look at a company that's say Delta Beverages. So Delta Beverages will have a section of engineers doing the maintenance, the machinery, and everything. Within that team, it then becomes important to have an environmental engineer such as Kombo, because she will have a different perspective that is not only saying let's be efficient, it will say let's be green. So when these particular products are marketed, or there's a pilot, when the report comes in, the environmental engineer is then able to say, oh, okay, perhaps we should look into this, because she has hindsight in the overall impact or the life cycle of that particular product, because it's biodegradable. The life cycle will end, versus plastic, where the life cycle will continue maybe for the next 100 or 200 years.
Fair enough.
Just to add on, I think the issue all boils down to the aspect of incentivization. If we are bringing in a new technology, I think there has to be a system in place to incentivize the investors or the developers, so that there is that ultimate adoption. Because usually people bemoan production cost for these so-called clean technologies. I'll give an example of a solar energy system. The developed world is always encouraging the developing countries to adopt solar energy. But the initial startup cost is expensive. Then they'll say, we'll give you loans, but then it will also create a cycle of debt and debt and debt. But if there can be an incentive for the adoption of these green technologies, then why not? We are ready to adopt them.
Just to add a bit to what Emily just spoke on with regards to the solar farms. So solar farms, in terms of the cons, she mentioned the startup cost. An additional, I suppose, cost to the environment is the land required for the solar farms. It's quite extensive. They're very big. However, when you perhaps take a sustainability perspective, you can see two problems as a solution. So we do have some areas that have experienced extreme deforestation, and you might have, let's say, a tobacco farmer who wants to go green. He's already prepared the land, it's flat. So you then approach those already derelict areas or already deforested areas, and then you consider those for your project, rather than going to find a new area to cut down and then put up the solar panels. Yeah.
Right, so to wrap up, I think we've spoken quite a bit, and there's lots more to talk about, because it's very vast. And, we touched on solar. There's a whole issue around solar and solar farms in this country, projects that were given money that haven't launched. But we won't get into that because of time. So I don't know if there's, what is it that, where should we be focusing our efforts, Kombo? Like, if you could pick one area where you say, as individuals and as a country, where should we be focusing on?
As a country, actually, I think that the government needs to set regulation towards carbon capping. I don't know if there is currently. There probably is, but no one is looking at that. And carbon capping is where you are paying people, where people are auctioning. They auction the amount of carbon that you can emit as a company, right? So people are buying these, and if you exceed, you're paying a fine and you're getting your license taken away or whatever. And this is an important. This makes money for the government for whatever they want to do, and this also helps in the amount of carbon dioxide that is. Because I mean, if you look at PPC or Lafarge, apparently they don't switch off their machines ever, only once a year. Can you imagine how much carbon we are emitting into the air every day? And I mean, you can just go outside and look at it if you live in that area. So carbon capping and measuring, the companies really need to know how much emission they are letting out into the air. I can bet my entire life in Zimbabwe that there are probably like 10 companies that know how much emission they're letting into the air, and no one is looking at that. So that's a really important thing. And as individuals, I think green commuting is important. There's a vibe in Zimbabwe that driving cars or whatever is important, but let's look at bikes. We can bike to work. That cuts out on cars, that cuts out on combustion that is happening with the cars, and also there's no congestion. You know what I mean? Let's bike, let's carpool, let's do like just the little things, you know? We're adding, you know.
Wimbiso?
I think I'll take my point from a green consciousness. I mentioned it before. So green consciousness, again, is the awareness of the environment. So, and I think this should happen across all sectors. So this would not be a top-down. This is not a bottom-up. This is a multi-sectoral view. This is where your end users, us, are saying, okay, listen, we want to recycle. I should be able to go onto the EMA website or whatever given government website and find out if I want to recycle my plastics, how do I do this? Where do I take it? These services should be easily accessible to everybody on every level. Then obviously in the rural communities, you could have that at the local government center, you know, your town hall or whatever your closest government body is. So essentially, I think it's essentially about awareness and education. And I think Emily also mentioned how behavioral change is difficult to change people's behaviors. These are habits cultivated over 40 years, 60 years. Okay, let's agree to disagree. It's difficult, but they are children that we are trying to essentially preserve the environment for them. So let's make sure they know how and, you know, learn from our mistakes. Let's integrate concepts of environmental. What's the Shona word for sustainability? What is that? If you can't go to a community and say, we want you to be sustainable, there's no Shona word for sustainability in terms of the environment in the context in which you want them to take up a project. Sit down with them. Go through their oral histories. You would be very shocked at how many environmentally conscious principles we have in our own cultures that are already pre-existing. So it's almost like I feel that we have it. We just need to coordinate better between government and the people as well as industry, all three sectors.
Okay.
Emily, the final word.
Yeah, it indeed was quite a fruitful discussion. I just would like to start by commenting on the aspect of emissions by companies. To say that as the government, once in 3 or 4 years, we submit a national document to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is called National Communications. That reference document, in a nutshell, details a country's climate change issues, to say what are our national circumstances when we talk of climate change, what are our vulnerabilities, what are our mitigation, and what our level of greenhouse gas emissions. So just to say, under the component of detailing the greenhouse gas emissions, these emissions are made mostly from from the input that is provided by such big companies that she was talking about, the kind of Lafarge and other big companies, the one Sebo, is it
Sebo Chemicals.
Yes, among other big companies. And once we have this kind of data, and then they are able to detail the kind of emissions that the country does, because they also say that some of these, we have got several companies, we can't list them all at once, but we look at the key significant companies that are polluting too much into the atmosphere, and then at the end of the day, we are able to estimate to say that the companies in Zimbabwe are emitting so much. And then in terms of my take-home messages, it would be to say that there is really need for the strengthening of the enabling environment, for climate change programming, more so climate change adaptation, to ensure that there is coherence in what we are talking about, to ensure that there is coherence of our policies speaking to climate change, our gender policing addressing the issue of climate change. When we look at the water policy or the energy policy or the forest sector, does it say anything about climate change? When we are able to achieve that coherence, I think that we are able to build that country resilience that we so want to build, so that we are able to reduce our vulnerability and explore all the low emission benefits or the so-called mitigation benefits wherever possible. Because our thrust is a country or as the government is to say that our thrust is adaptation. How can we build our resilience? But where possible, we'll then look at mitigation options. For example, in trying to provide or to cushion a livelihood in a district, we can put what are called nutrition gardens, and then we can ensure that these are powered by a solar-powered water conveyance system. So instead of that instead of that water conveyance system being powered by diesel, we are then able to explore a mitigation core benefit through the use of solar. So wherever possible, we want to explore the mitigation options, but building our resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies. Very fruitful discussion, as Emily mentioned. I hope that those that are watching got as much out of it as I did. I know that plastic straws are bad, and I definitely will be cutting down on them. Thank you for tuning into Politics and Beyond.